So can we use LLMs like ChatGPT in our products? And how about self-hosted versions?
If you want me to go first on this, so being self-hosted
yeah, go ahead.
or not is pretty much irrelevant. It boils down of this is our soups. So how much can you control those soups? And the issue is how much they do guides the performance of your device. And if they really like you are using ChatGPT to classify something, how can you show the evidence of that black box really has the scientific evidence? And for those that do not know a language model, they are not connecting things. They are not saying that, okay, we classify these things, we are connecting these kind of things. This is quite basic machine learning compared with many of the algorithms that use machine learning. So they're just saying the next letter or the next words based on this cloud of words that you provide me is this one. So they have no clue they are recommending something or diagnosing something. So how can you show any scientific evidence or validity of these kind of things? If you can do it, great. I don't know how you can do it today. So I'll say you cannot use it.
It comes down to the showing validity.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is down to the validity. If you have your own large language model when you can demonstrate it, then yes, I don't see there being an issue. But like you said, all the ChatGPT and all the other stuff like that, no, I can't see a way in the future of that happening. Even if you start using it to review your regulatory reporting or the wordings in your reports and everything, there's been cases where I've worked with clients in the past who have had an order come in and say, right, who authored this report? I want to speak to them to go through and for them to explain this report. If you've got whole sections of your report that's been done by ChatGPT or any other large language model that you don't control, the first question you're going to get is, well, this report is invalid because you can't demonstrate the suitability of the person who wrote it. And that is going to be a very big problem in the future as well. The easiest comparator to that, and I hate to bring it up, is going to be the students in universities and everything using large language models to actually write their reports and their theses and stuff, because we already know it's happening. And most of the time people are turning around and say, well, we can't actually use it because you can't talk to the person who wrote it. So how is that actually a valid report afterwards? And that is a big risk for any kind of healthcare system, to be honest with you, at the moment.
But if you verify, so basically the ChatGPT generates an answer for me, and I said, oh, this makes sense. I just wrote it quicker using ChatGPT, but I still take full responsibility.
No, that's a very, very grey area, and I think that would come down to notified body interpretation. It could even come down to a single auditor's interpretation, like the example that was given earlier. And personally, I would steer away from it, just because I think it's going to introduce too many complexities in the future when things actually get their act together.
So at the risk of oversimplifying things and as always being too radical and too simple, but I personally don't see a huge problem with using LLMs in medical devices. Like, as always, it just depends on the context in which you use them. Like, you already have medical devices on the market for stuff like image classification, image segmentation in radiology, for example, like patient prioritization in like emergency wards. Those, of course, are not LLMs, but you have some other machine learning model behind that. So now if I would do the same stuff with an LLM, inherently, I don't see a huge difference. I have some sort of LLM which is trained on data. You get some input. For example, you get an input, you get patients in an emergency ward in a hospital, and you have some output. Like, these patients are maybe classified as high risk, medium risk, or low risk. Now, what the logic in the machine learning product does, in my opinion, is not super important, because we already have the stuff in place to bring these into medical devices. As Christian Junior, for example, said, like, you have to document the training data, run it through a validation and a test set, and document all of that stuff. So inherently, I think LLMs are just kind of yet another machine learning model which we can use and which should be able to be deployed in medical devices. I think the thing which gets lumped together, which is a bit unfortunate, is that ChatGPT, the product ChatGPT right now, is hosted by OpenAI. And So in technical terms, the model weights are not frozen. So OpenAI kind of like, and this is actually kind of documented on Hacker News quite often, that the GPT-4 actually gets updated regularly, and its performance on some metrics actually decreases, or it has decreased over the past few months, which is kind of an interesting finding. And generally, like changing weights without going through the whole cycle of like release and like technical documentation and all that stuff, again with potential notified body review, that's currently not allowed. So the main problem of using ChatGPT in a medical device right now, in my opinion, is not the LLM, but it's actually that the weights kind of like change underneath you, and you don't have control of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, this is one of those areas that there is no really clear guidance or interpretation or even understanding in some regulatory bodies. Even the FDA's guidance on how to change a sort of algorithmic change protocols, they don't even mention LLMs in their guidance documents to actually handle that. The use of LLMs on healthcare records is a far easier sort of process, for want of a better phrase, than it would be in terms of a medical device. Having a statistical library in a medical device AI gives you your explainability, it gives you clinical evidence, it gives you all the different ways to actually say, yes, this is improved, this is how we can change it, and everything else. But having an LLM as your statistical library is something that is very difficult to maintain. Like you mentioned, it's all the weightings and everything else, but every time technically you change the statistical library to change the weightings, you would then actually have to revalidate your product and resubmit it to a notified body as a class 2. Well, if it's a class 2A, for example, it would be classified as a major change. So theoretically, what you're saying is, yes, we can use LLMs, which, yes, you can. But every time that LLM changes, you then have to resubmit those changes to your notified body for approval, because you're using the LLM as a statistical library.
So based on my past experience, the interesting finding was that there's a lot of variability between notified bodies regarding that, and there's kind
completely.
of no group. So the agreement, which I've seen at least 2 or 3 times, is that if you kind of like use the same model, and I'm kind of like referring to the model architecture and only like essentially retraining it with more data, and it leads to improved performance based on the same metrics you used in your clinical evaluation, for example, and your like, I guess like the performance evaluation for the model, then those 3 examples, those notified bodies would allow this change to, I guess in this context, be not significant and to be able to be shipped by the manufacturer without prior review. But again, all of these things boil down to kind of like individual agreements between the notified bodies and the actual like machine learning software manufacturers.
Yeah, and that's the issue, because I've seen that in that kind of example in a couple of other notified bodies with a couple of clients, and that got refused. So you're right; it's completely down to notified body interpretation of those different things. It's an absolute nightmare. It's a minefield.
Although this puts a bit on interpretation, maybe the lack of knowledge of many notified bodies does not allow some conversation. But Oliver, what you are describing is what is the definition of significant change, and if you can have a process and show what is the parameters that you proved and validated your algorithm, and you gave an example, if you show that you just increased performance, that is not a significant change, because you already approved with the notified body that a performance beyond that value was acceptable, and there was no reason to get back to it. The point and the challenge here, and you, Oliver, boil it down, even with FDA, they have good machine learning practice in the way that you don't need to submit to FDA every time you change your algorithm, but you always have to have a man in the loop of giving the final check on verification and validation. And this boils down to the challenge. You cannot rely in a algorithm that can change by itself as a significant change, and you cannot control. A point here, just a last point, and I think is relevant for the verification and validation discussion. This is always a challenge. Like, if you can show that you can verify and validate things, then you are okay. And the challenge with LLMs, yes, if you use them as a normal black box, similar to any machine learning, that you have these 3 inputs, you have like an output as a classifier. probably is irrelevant the kind of model you use in between. If you can show that the inputs are related to the outputs with the scientific validity, and this often you can do it. We have the example of the birds or the dogs, where there's not scientific validity does not seem, it's not exactly that the model is following that, but it may help. The issue with the LLMs is that you have multiple outputs, multiple inputs, and it's impossible to test for all of them. And that for me falls down the difficulty. I think the example you gave, Oliver, I think that is perfectly fine use of LLM, like for a simple classifier. But as I see a lot of doctors and institutions, we'll just read the notes of the doctor and give a diagnosis. We just chat with a model, like this chat for devices. That for me will be really. I don't see how can we verify and validate things, honestly, to be able to say, okay, this complies with what is expected.
Yeah.